course I have to blame Sonny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes. I mean, they're the primary two. I mean, they're the co-conspirators who created this mess.
You can't do it alone. She was and is a singular figure, and she does bear responsibility. I mean, even as young as she was, she bears responsibility for what happened under her watch. Oh, look, so many other people went along with her. You know, so many other people wanted it to happen. You know, she will say in her defense, you know, it wasn't me alone. And that's true. It's true of every entrepreneur. It's never them alone.
Where do you put Sonny Balwani in all of this?
I think he's really critical. He's in some ways, the bad cop to her good cop. And we often, in the case of tech companies, there's many instances of the man behind the curtain or the more silent partner. And you saw that at Apple with Steve and Steve. You see this at Microsoft with Paul Allen, writing BASIC, and Bill Gates.
I'm not sure the investors were wrong because I'm not sure they ever fulfilled their own obligations and responsibilities.
Venture capital, kind of the rule of thumb of VC is that out of 10 investments, you'll have 3 that fail, you'll have 3 that kind of go, fine, and you'll have 1 or 2 that actually make you money and sometimes make you a lot of money. And what makes the risk worth it is when you hit big.
The investment money was good eventually because it gives runway for scientists. So she did a good job at getting some runway later. But the first round of the technology obviously was a massive failure and was terrible for patients. But she did a good job at setting a vision for scientists to work towards to allow, a lot of companies don't have that much funding.
In private company investing, the prospective investor has to fill out a very detailed form that says, I understand the risks. I understand that, I may not get any return on this. I understand, furthermore, this will not affect my net worth.
They're accredited.
They're accredited. Sophisticated, actually, I think is the term, but and nobody did. I mean, they all filled out the form, but nobody did the work. I didn't see them storming the gates and going after the board saying, hey guys, you got to, in fact, the board was telling Elizabeth, you don't have to do that, which I think she got bad advice.
In announcing its settlement with Holmes, the SEC posed Theranos as a lesson for entrepreneurs, warning that innovators who seek to revolutionize and disrupt an industry must tell investors the truth about what their technology can do today, not just what they hope it might do someday.
I believe that the SEC did not have jurisdiction. I think the SEC has got a great role to play in public markets and all kinds of other things like that. But I'd hate to see them get deep into the venture community and the startup world. It's a fine line between that and, the mom and pop business, believe it or not.
There are some people who say that Elizabeth Holmes is being held to a public company standard. Do you think that that's a valid argument?
I think there's some merit in that. One of the things, particularly the last decade of Silicon Valley, kind of the decade since the Great Recession, that has been different has been the private markets have dominated more than the public markets. Companies would go public, they'd have to go public. I mean, Intel went public when it was 3 years old, Netscape went public when it was less than 2. The way you raise capital was on the public markets, and with that came accountability. And now, in the last decade, it's harder to go public, all right? New regulations post-recession, it's a heavier lift, and there's been all of this private capital just sloshing through the global markets looking for a home. And then you have this kind of flywheel of storytelling and buzz about, oh, this is the next big thing. And everyone's like, I want to get in on that. Then you're allowed in kind of you're protected from the scrutiny of public markets. Does that mean that you can get away with fraud? No. Investors are right to be, calling her to account.
Warmenhoven said early investors had every opportunity to do just that.
They did nothing in terms of trying to ascertain the current status of the product or the risks to completion or anything else.
Whose fault is that?
I think it's the investor's fault. Yeah, you invest in something, you want to know how your investment is doing. And I think it's also a symptom of the founder culture that has really took hold of the Valley exactly during the time that Theranos was growing.
The first meeting I was in was with all the major investors. And they hadn't had any meetings with the company since the round had closed. And maybe an occasional phone call or something, but nothing as a group, nothing where they got a status report, which I found staggering.
And weren't demanding it?
They didn't seem to press hard before the investment, and they still didn't seem to press hard after the investment. From my viewpoint, it was really out of character for a startup investor not to be all over it. If you were a venture capitalist and you put in $100 million, you would be there every week. How are we doing? Are we on track?
So those documents do not exist.
Not in the hands of the investors. I mean, they were available internally.
Internal documents may have exposed the chasm between Theranos' aspiration and ability, though Holmes told the SEC its investor pitch left room for improvement.
We didn't intend these documents to be standalone, and sitting here now, I know we could have been much better at the way we prepared materials.
And did you talk about specifically the technology and blood draw and what was in place at that time versus what was aspirational? Was there a clear delineation between those two?
We tried to do that.
When we look at Theranos investors, many of them, not necessarily your clients, but certainly perhaps a VC fund, we would expect to be seasoned investors who can properly vet a company, a startup like Theranos.
In this case, probably what you would consider a seasoned investor like Tim Draper, perhaps Larry Ellison and Oracle, they invested early when it was just a concept. And a lot of VCs will invest even when it's not proven. Theranos got well beyond that and then started raising funds, massive amount of funds, over $700 million, from other investors.
The amounts of money that a certain class of what I call mega VCs with untold, unprecedented amounts of capital available to invest, starting with a Japanese company, SoftBank, and some of the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East who are looking for what to do after the oil begins to peter out, are able to and are bringing amounts of money that have just never been seen before. There's no independent validation. That's what concerns me now when we look at some of these mega funded companies like WeWork and Uber, that it hasn't been vetted as much as you would normally hope and expect from at least an independent venture capital set of players. And that adds to the board and the CEO, and here we are.
And they go dig inside the company and get the facts. Start with Channing Robertson, start with the head of engineering, and start asking questions.
In addition to Holmes, it was Channing Robertson who in 2016 gave Warmenhoven confidence to join Theranos' board, even after media and lawyers had accused Holmes of fraud.
And he had just concluded organizing two, we call it blue ribbon panels, one that looked at the science of the biochemistry inside the box, and another one looking at the mechanical nature of the box to make sure that it was all viable and doable, and they both came back very positive. So I didn't get in deep to understand how far they were from go-to-market, but I did have enough confidence that the fundamentals were sound.
He clearly thought that she was special, and when she felt like starting a company, he's the one she went to.
He was being paid quite handsomely to work for her, and had a desk in their offices. And he claimed that he didn't know about that technology, and he claimed that he didn't know about the fact that that things didn't work. He claimed he didn't know things were being run on third-party equipment. I don't know what the heck was going on with him, why he wouldn't ask these questions, why he claims to have been completely in the dark. And he's the one that brought her around, got her credibility, and was paid handsomely, annually.
One former board member reportedly did ask the hard questions. According to ABC, Avi Tevanian, software engineer and former right-hand man to Steve Jobs, was asked to resign in 2007, following his ultimatum that Holmes be replaced as CEO.
The way that startup boards are usually, they're made up of venture investors, and they're made up of other people with domain expertise. And, at the early stage, later stage, corporations may, look even more widely for people who have domain expertise in politics and statecraft. Sure, because they have domain expertise in understanding how large organizations can run and interact with the rest of the world. Something's off from the very early stage.
I would say there was a lack of scientific mentorship overall. It was the assay teams, and that was it. There was little other science guidance given to the actual scientists.
So even Channing Robertson was not interacting with your group?
No, he wasn't present as far as I could tell.
That did set Theranos apart from the very beginning, and it was a red flag to other potential venture investors in the tech and particularly the biotech space. It's a biotech company that doesn't have the personnel or the procedures in place that a biotech company would need to have even at the very beginning stage to develop product.
In 2016, Theranos finally impaneled a medical board. And under new leadership, Holmes presented a scaled-back version of its updated device, the Mini Lab, to the American Association for Clinical Chemistry.
There's clearly been a lot of interest in your company. I would argue that a lot of that comes from the fact that there were these claims that were made that were very broad early on. 70 tests, the whole panoply of lab tests from a couple drops of blood. And the evidence that you presented fell far short of that. So how should we think about that?
Well, I think we fully understand in picking this place to come to introduce it that we have a lot of work to do to engage with this community. And I can tell you, I wish that I had started earlier in the context of building the scientific and medical board that we've had the privilege to build.
Under legal pressures and burning cash, the effort would prove too late.
Should the board have looked at its own composition and said, perhaps we don't have the level of expertise that's required for a revolutionary healthcare company?
Yes, but you're asking people to admit their own weaknesses. Let's give credit to Elizabeth Holmes. She was quite the charmer, and people just felt great and important. In their own minds, I'm sure they thought they were providing good sage counsel. But yes, of course, that should be a part of the equation as well.
Stanford Medical School professor Dr. Phyllis Gardner reportedly critiqued fingerstick draws as an impossible source from which to glean accurate results for hundreds of tests. She described Theranos investors as crazy and its board members as old men whose brains had gone to their groin. Yet the suggestion that Holmes' concept was nothing more than fantasy fails to account for a flood of diagnostic startups surfacing in her wake. Take Genelite and its Maverick analyzer that's FDA approved and on its way to running more than 100 common tests from a tiny drop of blood.
Over here is our proprietary technology. So this is a machine we just got cleared from the FDA. And what it's really good at is analyzing blood proteins. Nobody else has a machine that can analyze a large number of blood proteins in 15 minutes on the whole blood in a physician setting. So that's our ambition.
The Maverick can perform much of what Holmes envisioned. The device features a proprietary optical silicon sensor that detects color changes in light when it's exposed to targeted blood molecules. For now, blood comes from a low-volume draw taken from a patient's arm. And next is the FDA's decision for the Maverick to perform about 200 common diagnostic tests from a fingerstick.
It is a politically charged topic to operate off of a fingerstick. What you'll see when we take the blood out of the tube is we're going to take a tiny fraction of one drop of blood. Okay. So we've validated that our machine works on less than a drop of blood. We're going to add less than a drop of blood to it.
Less than a drop?
Yeah, so it's about 4% of one drop that we use.
In late 2020, the Maverick was also granted emergency use authorization to diagnose SARS-CoV-2, also known as COVID-19. It's one of 28 approved coronavirus and flu tests that can all be performed from a fingerstick.
Eventually, how many tests are you hoping that Genelite will be capable of performing on one device?
That list is well under 200 tests. It's really about 100 tests comprise the vast majority of that. And there's only a few of those that we can't do. We can get to 95% of all commonly ordered tests in 15 minutes.
So what do you have to say to the critics who said Theranos' vision was science fiction?
Well, I think you just saw it happen in the other room.
So this is what the future looks like. A small sample of blood can perform hundreds of tests.
Exactly.
While not every test can be accomplished using a tiny drop of blood, the advancements show Holmes may have had the right concept and the right story without enough technology at the right time.
There's a difference between the idea and the execution, clearly. But decentralization of diagnostics and getting more data into the hands of doctors when they're making decisions is vital.
Beyond Genelite, investment in miniaturized diagnostics hardly dried up when Theranos was forced to close its doors. Similar startups have been proving the concept as anything but science fiction. There's Athelis, a Sequoia-backed in-home blood testing device touting technology to detect white blood cell count, viral infections, and cancer from a single drop. And Truvian's portable benchtop analyzer takes 5 drops of blood to deliver multiple assays within 20 minutes. If the latest technology is living proof that Holmes' concept was sound, where exactly was her Achilles heel?
If she had dialed it back and was straightforward about using commercial analyzers and was straightforward that, this is about access, this is about getting patients' blood draw somewhere else and that kind of stuff, and said that, and we're working on our finger stick technology, we're working on this, then, we could have gotten there, most likely.
This is an epic fail of a self-inflicted need for speed that proved to be very dangerous and fatal to the company, and we could have had an entirely different story. And on top of this, we have to do it at breakneck speed. And this was a case where literally and figuratively speed kills.
It's easy to blame the people involved. It's easy to say, oh, you investors, you should have known better. You should have looked more closely. But the hype machine is powerful. The magazine covers are powerful.
Maybe if enough people don't want to dig deep enough, because we all want to believe, we'll prop them up, we'll put them on the cover of magazines, and they can just plow forward, and maybe eventually they'll make it or maybe not. But there definitely is a public hunger for that kind of celebrity.
Nearly a year before the journal's expose, John Ioannidis published a critique of Theranos and other well-funded healthcare startups for a lack of peer-reviewed data and for keeping their intellectual property too close to the vest.
Theranos had published practically nothing. That they had a couple of papers, but they were not relevant to their technologies. So there are several unicorns out there with very high valuations, with very little or no evidence that is supported by peer-reviewed publications.
Why is peer-reviewed publication so important in your opinion?
This is how science is run. This is how we can put trust that something has merit, that something is real, that something can be scrutinized by other scientists and be proven, or at least sustain some criticism and show that it is relatively bulletproof.
Holmes' sleight of hand didn't go entirely unnoticed. Fortune's editorial team did note limits to their account.
Have this sentence in the original piece that was published in June of 2014. It said, quote, precisely how Theranos accomplishes all of these amazing feats is a trade secret. So what does a journalist do from there?
It's difficult to cover proprietary technology. What do we really know about Facebook's algorithms, and how far can we go in there? Well, some of it is ultimately a trade secret.
So it's an unproven proprietary technology, particularly as it pertains to something as sensitive as healthcare, that we probably should have been more skeptical about or had more questions about. And I think it's a great lesson.
Just because someone is claiming they're doing it doesn't mean that the media and the investment community and everyone else should just believe them. And it's often harder for the media because they don't have the same amount of time or necessarily the technical depth. Whether it's the media, investors, or customers, everyone needs to do the work and make sure that what they're doing is they're getting into bed with someone who's doing a good job.
And look, it's not just the media. The media consists of the people who produce it and the people who read it, right? And then when it all comes crashing down, we rush out to buy the books, we rush out to watch the documentaries, we sort of salivate over the, look at all, what a fraud, those silly people. And so we kind of delight in the failure stories as well as the successes. And it does become hard to put it in context and see the broader facts and say, well, this was a manifestation of a bigger problem.
While Theranos' purported trade secrets were walled off from journalists and outsiders, another party, aside from investors and the board, had power to probe deeper. According to Walgreens, in March 2010, Holmes and Balwani pitched Theranos devices to Walgreens company executives as viable and consumer-ready, and said its technology had been comprehensively validated by 10 of the 15 largest pharmaceutical companies.
Do you place any blame there?
I place huge blame with Walgreens, but it's more on the negligence side. I don't believe that Walgreens knew what was going on, but they should have known what was going on. It's almost inconceivable to me that they didn't know that things were being run on third-party tests.
Somehow things got embellished. There was never any concept anywhere in reality that they could do 150 tests with 1 drop of blood. It was they could do different panels of tests with each with a drop of blood. Part of it was how Elizabeth talked, but part of it was what people wanted to hear. Wow, this is amazing, But the truth was, rather than getting 3 or 4 vials of blood taken, it would be a very small sample. And in fact, the sample could be normally a finger prick, and you could just get the drop of blood, let's say off your thumb or whatever, and have no need to poke a vein. So there's a lot of good things to it, but somehow the 1 drop of blood, that's what got put in the machine. But to do the whole panel, 150, probably would have taken 25, 30 drops of blood.
In a deposition before the SEC, Holmes admitted that Theranos had kept Walgreens in the dark over FDA concerns that the nanotainer had been underclassified. Yet she maintained the move away from fingerstick tests was no secret.
Walgreens was operating with us in the store, so they would have known locally that we were doing venipuncture to the extent we were doing venipuncture.
Do you have a general sense of what Walgreens was concerned about following the publication of the article?
I think there were multiple issues. One was they were reacting to the press in general, but then the other was that we hadn't disclosed the engagement with FDA with them to them yet, before it was in the press.
Holmes argues that because the FDA engagement had to do only with nanotainers and because it began months and in some cases years after soliciting investors, it can have no bearing on the government's claims of fraud.
Once the Walgreens conclude we can't get this deployed in the store, from Theranos' viewpoint, they just should have said, time out. What you want to do doesn't fit our architecture, our product strategy, nothing. But that's really kind of where they took the left turn that sent them right in the ditch.
Red flags did spook world-renowned medical center Cleveland Clinic. It bailed on a partnership after Theranos left its due diligence requests ignored. And Walgreens competitor Safeway also withdrew its plans for a pilot program.
Was that the value add for Theranos? Was $140 million up front?
It got them on the map in a hurry. But the Walgreens deal gave it credibility. And so, it helped them basically raise the money they were looking for. That kind of proposal, something of that size and magnitude, should have been reviewed at the board in depth. And there were enough people on the board to say, wait a minute, this is not us.
In deposition testimony, board member Schultz and retired U.S. Navy Admiral Gary Ruffhead said they did not question Holmes or anyone else at Theranos once public concerns were raised about Theranos' use of third-party technology.
The board had some very competent people and experienced people, good operating people in some ways, and they should have just called a halt. I'm not sure it was ever fully discussed at the board. And Elizabeth, as CEO, had the right to turn it down or to take it to the board.
And what about Sonny Balwani? What was his role as you understood it?
I never met Sonny. He'd been dismissed from the company before I showed up. Elizabeth was the chief architect, and she led most of the engineering program, but Sonny led all the rest of the operations.
Veterans of Silicon Valley startups know that faking it can be fair game.
Many of these companies start an idea, they think that they have it, actually they don't, but they hope that they will develop the working idea while they're pursuing it. And they have that expectation that let's go ahead and it will kind of get itself together and it will be successful. This is not fraud. I mean, this could be seen as visionary. The distinction between fraud and visionary is very subtle here.
These high-risk, high-reward gambles have been taken by some of the most famous visionaries, and even the inventor who inspired Holmes' first prototype, Thomas Edison.
He was the original fake it till you make it guy. Now, he was different than Elizabeth Holmes in that he ultimately did make it. He was an inventor who got it right. And along the way, when he was having trouble with the incandescent light bulb, he didn't let anybody in on that. He faked demonstrations. He was not so dissimilar from other famous people in Silicon Valley, like, say, Steve Jobs, who was a notorious liar, but also a great storyteller. So she is in that tradition, and that's what makes Elizabeth Holmes interesting.
Was she an out-and-out fraud, or was she, just in the great tradition of Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs, faking it till she made it? And it could sort of be a little bit both.
She's part of a tradition of fake it till you make it, which to some extent is celebrated in Silicon Valley, but not so much when it comes to medical devices that can actually affect the health of people.
Is there a certain point with respect to Theranos where you say that's where things went wrong?
I think that there was a gradient going down the tubes, and it's hard to say which specific decision was the worst. I believe that here my response will be biased. I think the decision to move to patients was probably the worst, without having something that was mature. Because once you move to patients, then you're exposing people to risk.
In pushing a soft-baked healthcare pitch, Holmes isn't alone. In its early days, Silicon Valley biotech company 23andMe was ordered by the FDA to immediately discontinue marketing its widely publicized cheek swab test after making unsubstantiated claims that the company could identify risk levels for a number of diseases. A consumer class action lawsuit followed, and the company settled with complaining customers. Diagnostic startup Ubiome was dropped from CVS after federal investigators and an FBI raid of its San Francisco headquarters. In 2021, the company's co-founders Jessica Richman and Zachary Apt were accused by the SEC of defrauding investors and indicted by the DOJ for money laundering and securities fraud. Even the FDA and experienced megacorporations have been known to get it wrong. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists found in 2018 that over the prior decade, 80,000 global deaths and nearly 2 million injuries were linked to faulty medical devices. Take FDA-approved vaginal mesh implanted in approximately 10 million women worldwide before the agency banned U.S. sales over risks including organ perforation, protrusion, and death. Its manufacturers, among others, Boston Scientific, Johnson & Johnson, Coloplast, and C.R. Bard. And healthcare giant Bayer was forced by the FDA to restrict sales of its permanent birth control device Essure after reported complications involving device migration and death. This widespread imprecision is evidence that as the next biotech billion is already being raised and spent, from startups to multinationals, there's much to be learned and improved.
Elizabeth Holmes was made possible by a broader culture, and her downfall and the attention given to it is also a reflection of the broader culture. There still are investors out there hunting down, who's the next bright young person, man or woman, who's going to have the world-changing product.
I think that we have a lot to learn from understanding what happened with Theranos. But I wouldn't like us to lose the bigger picture. The bigger picture being that there's hundreds of companies out there that may be like Theranos eventually, many of them.
How do investors who want and care about getting accurate information out of a very opaque company, where should they look?
I'll tell you, All this stuff scares me. And then there's a lot of stuff in Silicon Valley, actually, technical stuff, chip companies, telecom, even medical stuff that people don't understand. I urge people to make sure they understand. And it's, sometimes it's not 100% possible. You can make a rule with yourself. So I don't really understand it. I'm not going to invest in it.
Whether founders can back up what they boast may depend on how vigorously interested parties demand to look behind the curtain.
I mean, there are several sort of checks and balances, and it could be the press, it could be the board, it could be investors. Theranos was a case where all of those entities let down their guard because the story was so great, and they believed in the mission, and they believed that success would be around the corner until it wasn't. There's a cautionary tale to be looking a little deeper into the underlying economics. I think boards clearly have to be more vigilant than they've been.
I mean, ask if it is a secret, but 90% of the time, I think in Silicon Valley, they're going to tell you it's a secret.
Now, a lot of these biotech startup companies, their IP is very important to them and they want to protect it.
There's indeed some tension between IP and peer review disclosure. With patents, it's possible to protect IP and at the same time allow someone to disclose sufficient information.
Even with patents and peer review, biotech founders and their funders may need to take a few leaps of faith.
You always think when you start a new science project, you don't know what the unknowns are. And so that naivete of not knowing what roadblocks you're going to hit, what you're going to have to solve along the way, I think that has a long way to go with being an innovator, right? The naivete, they joke, is a really important piece of innovation.
Yeah. You need money in science. You need a lot of it. And you don't know if it's going to work, but you need guidance.
We don't want to get rid of visionary people. We don't want to get rid of people who really take a shot at a very high-risk idea. We don't want them to think that if they do that, they're just going to end up in jail. We want them to take the best shot, but we also want to have some transparency about what is being done.
Just how much transparency is demanded of future visionaries may also depend on how much light the Justice Department shines on private markets by way of Holmes and Balwani.
A lot of entrepreneurs would love to have that much money. Why do you think that Theranos chose not to just keep its head down and keep the research going?
Once you've gone public and you've got this dialogue and mantra and there's all this momentum that you have to maintain, it's very hard to turn that off and go into stealth mode again for a period of time. So there was really, that's a big part of it.
I think Elizabeth had a great big dream. I don't think there was any governors put on her, no speed limits. But that's the case with a lot of people. Some work out, some don't. She made some bad decisions too. She's not home free. But I always felt like she was fully committed to try to deliver the product and make the company successful, and to do that with all the energy she had. And she gave it her all. To a certain degree, like I said, I know people are going to laugh when they say, how is she a victim?
Do you see Elizabeth Holmes at all as a victim of this culture?
I think to some degree she is. I mean, look, she was and is so young.
There's two ways that we can look at Theranos. One way is to say that it is a bad apple and that the people involved, the CEO or whoever else, were psychopaths and bad people, and they were cheating and it's all fraud and everyone else is wonderful and perfect. In a way, there's some sort of recall bias, to use a scientific term. If Elizabeth Holmes had managed to pull this off and get the technology up and running and develop something that worked, everybody would consider her a hero, the most famous person of the 21st century, probably.
If I were fired or I had to start this company over a lot of times in order to figure out how to get this right, I would, right? And I would just do the same thing over and over again.
day.